Welcome to U.S. Civil War history. Storytelling is a dying convention and one of the hardest niches to keep alive on YouTube. But with your support, we can keep it breathing, passing the voices of the past into the future. If you value long-form history told as it was lived, please subscribe, like this video, and share it. Every click helps keep these stories from fading into the past. Today, we're heading deep into Confederate territory. April 1862. A train is stolen. A war hangs in the balance, and what follows is one of the most extraordinary pursuits in military history. This is the Great Locomotive Chase. The sun had barely climbed over the Georgia hills when the general hissed to a halt at the tiny station of Big Shanty. Passengers and crew stepped down for breakfast at the station hotel, steam curling from the locomotive's stack, the rhythmic tick-tick of cooling metal filling the air. Among the travelers were a group of men in plain clothes, quiet, unremarkable. They blended easily into the crowd, just another handful of passengers stretching their legs. But the moment the conductor stepped inside for his morning meal, they made their move. In seconds, the strangers climbed into the cab. The engineer's seat was suddenly occupied. The fireman's shovel scraped coal into the roaring firebox. The throttle jerked forward, and the locomotive lurched ahead. At first, no one understood what was happening. Then the shouting began. "They've taken the train!" But the general was already gathering speed, her iron wheels biting into the rails. The men aboard weren't joyriding thieves. They were Union soldiers, and they were about to strike at the heart of the Confederate war effort. What they didn't know was that the man they'd just robbed, a Confederate conductor named William Fuller, was about to give them the chase of their lives. To understand why the theft of the Gentoo, the general shook the Confederacy, you have to picture the South in 1862. The Civil War was well into its second year, and in the West, the Confederacy's survival hinged on a narrow ribbon of iron, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. This single track ran from Atlanta up to Chattanooga, Tennessee, threading through forests, hills, and small Georgia towns. On it moved everything the Confederate Army in the region needed: food, ammunition, reinforcements. Lose it, and the lifeline to the Deep South would wither. The Union knew this. Brigadier General Ormsby Mitchell, commanding in Tennessee, had a bold idea: sever that rail link, and Confederate forces in Chattanooga would be stranded. Atlanta, the beating heart of the South, would be exposed. But getting behind enemy lines to destroy bridges and rails was nearly impossible, unless someone could bring the war to the rails themselves. That's where James J. Andrews came in, a civilian spy with a knack for daring plans. He had worked with the Union Army before, guiding small missions in the South. Now, he proposed something audacious: disguise a team of Union soldiers as ordinary travelers, slip deep into Georgia, and when the chance came, steal a Confederate train. Then, race it north toward friendly lines, tearing up tracks, burning bridges, and cutting telegraph wires along the way, crippling Confederate communication and movement. If it worked, it could shorten the war in the West. If it failed, there would be no rescue party, no prison exchange, only a noose. Still, 22 men volunteered. They didn't just sign up for a mission. They signed up for a gamble that history would remember or bury forever. By early April, they were in position. Dressed as civilians, scattered across train cars to avoid suspicion, they waited for Andrews' signal. And on the morning of April 12, 1862, opportunity rolled into the station at Big Shanty. In early April 1862, Andrews and his men slipped out of Union-held territory in small groups to avoid suspicion. Disguised as Southern civilians, farmers, merchants, travelers, they drifted into Georgia, blending with the steady flow of people on the roads. By April 11th, most had gathered in Marietta, a bustling little town on the Western and Atlantic line. They stayed at separate inns, never meeting as a whole group to avoid drawing attention. There was a tense undercurrent. Each man knew that if caught, they wouldn't be treated as prisoners of war. As spies and saboteurs, they faced execution. But in the shadow of this danger, there was also excitement. If they succeeded, they could shorten the war in the West by months. On the misty morning of April 12th, the raiders boarded a northbound train in Marietta. At the front was a sturdy, wood-burning locomotive called the General. A few stops later, in the small town of Big Shanty, now Kennesaw, the train halted so passengers and crew could take breakfast at the Lacey Hotel. There was no telegraph office nearby, making it the perfect spot to act. As the crew and passengers stepped off the train, Andrews quietly gave the signal. The raiders uncoupled the passenger cars, leapt into the cab, and under engineer William Knight's hand, the General hissed to life. With a sharp blast of the whistle, they pulled away, leaving startled townsfolk and a few Confederate soldiers gaping in disbelief. In an instant, the Great Locomotive Chase had begun. The raiders worked quickly. Telegraph wires were cut, rails were pried loose, and track switches thrown to slow any pursuit. But they hadn't counted on the determination of the General's conductor, William A. Fuller. When Fuller emerged from the Lacey Hotel and saw his locomotive steaming north without him, he reacted instantly. At first, he and two companions sprinted after it on foot, an absurd but determined chase. Realizing they couldn't catch it that way, they commandeered a handcar, pumping furiously along the rails. Eventually, they found another locomotive, the Yonah, and the pursuit truly began in earnest. It was now a race, the General charging north with saboteurs aboard, and a relentless Confederate crew closing in behind. The whistle screamed as the General hurtled north, her iron wheels pounding the rails like a war drum. Behind her, Captain William Fuller was giving the Confederacy a lesson in sheer stubbornness. At first, he chased on foot, coat flapping, shouting for help at every station. Then he leapt onto a handcar, pumping the levers with two railroad workers until his arms burned. At Big Shanty, he commandeered a switch engine, Yonah, pushing it to its limits before leaping to William R. Smith, then finally to the pride of the Western and Atlantic line, the Texas. Here's the twist. The Texas was facing the wrong way. Fuller didn't stop to turn it around. He drove it in reverse at full speed, flying through curves and over bridges, his crew shoveling coal like men possessed. Meanwhile, Andrews and his raiders were in trouble. Cutting telegraph wires had slowed them down. They paused to pry up rails, but each delay gave Fuller precious minutes. And they weren't just fighting time. Confederate sentries were now aware something was wrong. Trackside workers shouted, passengers watched from sidings, and the South was waking up to the theft of the General. Every mile, the chase grew tighter. The distance between the engines? Now less than a mile. The shriek of the Texas's whistle could be heard over the wind, a predator closing in on its prey. By late morning, the General was gasping like a dying animal. Her boiler pressure dropped. Coal and water were running dangerously low. The raiders dumped boxcars to lighten the load, even set one ablaze to block Fuller's path. But the Texas smashed through the flaming wreck like it was matchwood. Andrews knew the mission was failing. The bridges they'd hoped to burn still stood. The rails ahead were intact, and Confederate troops were now closing in from both directions. Then came the final, fateful stretch. Smoke poured from the stack in ragged bursts. The speed dropped from 40 miles an hour to 20, then 15. Fuller's engine was almost touching their rear car. In the cab, Andrews gave the word no soldier wants to hear: abandon her. Men leapt from the train, rolling down embankments, scattering into the Georgia woods. Some limped from twisted ankles. Others clutched pistols, ready for a fight. The once mighty General rolled to a silent stop, her steam fading into the quiet of the countryside. Fuller had done the impossible. chased down a stolen train across 87 miles of enemy territory. But the war for these men was far from over. The raiders didn't get far. Wet, hungry, and deep in hostile land, they were hunted down one by one. Confederate possess moved quickly, and by the end of 2 weeks, every man was in custody. Their treatment was brutal. James Andrews, the civilian leader, was hanged in Atlanta for espionage. 7 others would share his fate. Yet even in prison, the raiders didn't stop resisting. 8 made a daring escape, slipping through the bars on a rainy night, with some reaching Union lines. For those who survived, a rare honor awaited. In March 1863, the first ever Medals of Honor were awarded to survivors of the Great Locomotive Chase. It was a recognition of courage in a mission that, while failing tactically, succeeded in becoming one of the most legendary tales of the Civil War. And so the story of the general lives on, not just in museums or history books, but in the rails that still stretch across Georgia. A reminder that war is not only fought with bullets and bayonets, but sometimes with wheels and steam. The Great Locomotive Chase, a tale of daring, grit, and sacrifice. Thank you for keeping history alive with us. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories from America's past. And until next time, keep the history rolling.